April 26, 1986. The night begins like many others at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Quiet, routine, controlled. Reactor number 4 is in a scheduled shutdown. There are no emergency signals, no alarms, no sense of urgency. To those inside the control room, this is not a dangerous night. It is a working night. The shift is preparing for a test, a technical experiment that has already been delayed multiple times. Its purpose seems simple: to see whether a turbine, after shutdown, can briefly power essential systems. On paper, it is a formality, a box to check, not a risk. This experiment is not perceived as dangerous. The reactor has operated for years. Similar tests were conducted before. Within this logic, catastrophe is not part of the equation. The system is trusted. The process is familiar. The outcome is assumed. What matters most is this: the path to disaster does not begin with the explosion. It begins earlier, in decisions made calmly, in assumptions accepted as normal, in confidence that the system knows its limits. Earlier that day, the test was postponed again, not for safety reasons, but to meet the demands of the electrical grid. The reactor remains at low power for hours. This creates instability, unseen, but critical. At low power, the reactor accumulates xenon, a condition that makes control difficult. The reactor becomes unpredictable. In such a state, procedures call for stopping the test. But stopping means delay, and delay means explanation. Instead of shutting down, power is restored manually. Control rods are withdrawn. Automatic safeguards are limited or disabled. Each step appears justified. Each step follows internal logic. No single action feels reckless. By the time the test begins, the reactor is operating outside stable design conditions. Low power, minimal control margin, disabled protections. A state not intended, but not forbidden. The turbine is disconnected. Water flow changes. Steam forms rapidly. In this reactor design, steam does not reduce power. It increases it. Operators attempt an emergency shutdown. The AZ5 button is pressed. It is meant to stop everything, instantly. But the control rods have graphite tips. In the first seconds, they increase reactivity. Instead of stopping the reaction, they accelerate it. Power surges beyond measurable limits. Fuel channels rupture. Water flashes into steam. Pressure becomes uncontrollable. A steam explosion tears the reactor apart. Moments later, a second blast follows. The reactor core is exposed. The system is destroyed. In the control room, disbelief follows. Reactor explosions are considered impossible. Early reports deny core destruction. Radiation readings are dismissed as faulty. Information moves slowly. Evacuation is delayed. Public warnings are withheld. Maintaining control becomes the priority. Chernobyl was not just a technical failure. It was the result of decisions, taken calmly, repeated logically, within a system that treated stopping as failure. The explosion was the outcome, not the cause.
The test scheduled for the night of April 26th was officially classified as technical. Its stated goal appeared practical and reasonable: to determine whether a turbine generator, already disconnected from the reactor, could continue producing electricity for a short time using its own rotational inertia. Those few seconds were critical. They were meant to bridge the gap between the loss of external power and the activation of backup diesel generators. The problem was that this experiment was not new. It had existed for years as an unresolved requirement. Previous attempts had either produced unsatisfactory results or were never properly documented. The test moved from plan to plan, from report to report, never fully completed. Formally, the test was mandatory. In practice, it was repeatedly postponed. By 1986, completing the experiment had become less about safety and more about closing an open item in official reporting. The reactor was scheduled for a planned shutdown for maintenance. This was the last convenient opportunity to finally resolve the issue. Canceling the test would have meant postponing it again and explaining that delay to higher levels of management. Originally, the test was intended to be performed during the day, but power grid demands delayed the reduction in reactor output. Electricity was needed elsewhere. The schedule shifted. The test was moved to the night shift. At night, the personnel were different. Direct oversight was reduced. On paper, nothing about this decision appeared dangerous. Night shifts were standard practice. The reactor remained under control. Documentation was in place. But this was where the first compromises began to appear. The experiment was now being adapted to circumstances, instead of circumstances being adapted to the experiment. The goal became execution, not because anyone sought danger, but because abandoning the test would have challenged the system's sense of control. At that point, the test was no longer just a technical procedure. It had become a managerial decision to proceed even when the original conditions no longer applied. This choice did not create an accident. It created a situation where small deviations could no longer be safely absorbed. The RBMK reactor used at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was not an experimental design. It was a serial reactor, already operating at other nuclear stations across the Soviet Union. It was considered tested, predictable, reliable. The RBMK was powerful and economically efficient. It allowed fuel replacement while the reactor was still running. This made it highly attractive for large-scale deployment. Efficiency became part of its identity, and efficiency suggested control. But alongside these advantages, vulnerabilities existed. They were not obvious in daily operation. They did not appear as immediate threats. They existed in specific conditions, at the edges of normal operation. One of the most critical features was the reactor's positive void coefficient. In certain operating modes, an increase in steam inside the reactor core did not reduce power, it increased it. Instead of stabilizing itself, the reactor could amplify dangerous conditions. This behavior was not unknown. Designers knew it. Scientists knew it. Research institutes documented it. The risk existed in calculations, reports, and technical discussions. In practice, the risk was considered theoretical. It was assumed that if operating regulations were followed, the danger would never materialize. The risk existed on paper, not in the mind. Another issue lay in the design of the control rods. Their graphite tips caused a brief increase in reactivity before reducing it. Under normal conditions, this effect was considered negligible. The effect had not caused accidents before. Years of operation passed without catastrophe, and each successful year reinforced confidence. Absence of failure became evidence of safety. These design characteristics were not hidden. They were interpreted as acceptable, as manageable technical nuances. Risk was not eliminated, it was absorbed. Over time, potential danger stopped feeling dangerous. The system adapted to it, and what once required caution became routine. This is how risk becomes normal. Knowledge of danger did not produce a sense of threat. The system knew, but it did not feel at risk. And as long as nothing happened, there was no reason to think otherwise. The test conducted on the night of the Chernobyl disaster was not a sudden decision. It had been planned in advance and postponed several times before. Its official goal was simple: to determine whether the turbine generator could temporarily supply electricity to the plant's own systems after external power was lost, until backup systems activated. Such tests were considered mandatory. Their results were required for documentation, for formal acceptance of the reactor unit, and for meeting operational plans. The experiment was not perceived as dangerous. It was treated as a technical formality that simply needed to be completed. Long before the critical moment, the situation began to drift away from the planned scenario. Due to demands from the power grid, the reactor was held at reduced power for an extended period of time. This prolonged low-power operation caused a known effect: xenon poisoning, a condition in which the reactor becomes unstable and increasingly difficult to control. The phenomenon was well understood in theory. When reactor power unexpectedly dropped close to zero, procedures were clear. The experiment should have been stopped, the reactor should have been shut down, and the test postponed. But stopping meant another delay, more approvals, more explanations, and potentially questions from higher management. Instead of shutting down, a decision was made to restore power and continue the experiment. To raise power, more and more control rods were withdrawn from the core. Automatic safety systems were disabled or bypassed to prevent them from interrupting the test. These actions were not chaotic. They followed a familiar logic of manual control used during complex operating modes. No one believed they were acting outside the system.
Power needed to be raised, so rods were withdrawn. Automation interfered, so it was disabled. The experiment was approved, so it had to be completed. Each decision appeared reasonable on its own.
Calm, analytical, documentary voice. Power needed to be raised, so rods were withdrawn. Automation interfered, so it was disabled. The experiment was approved, so it had to be completed. Each decision appeared reasonable on its own. The system rewarded completion, not interruption. Stopping a process was treated as a failure. Finishing the task was treated as competence.
The reactor entered a state that combined low power, instability, minimal control margin, and disabled safety systems. This configuration was not considered normal, but it was not perceived as critical.
The disaster did not begin with a button press. It began earlier, with the decision not to stop the experiment.
Chernobyl became possible, not because one rule was broken, but because the system allowed and encouraged the test to continue at any cost.
By the time the experiment began, the reactor was already in a highly unstable state. Power was being held at a level where the RBMK reactor became extremely sensitive to even minor changes. Most of the control rods had been withdrawn from the core. The remaining control margin was minimal. The reactor was operating close to the limits of controllability. Automatic safety systems were either disabled or unable to function fully. The reactor was no longer protected by its normal layers of automation. The experiment began with the shutdown of steam supply to the turbine. This caused a drop in pressure and altered the reactor's heat removal conditions. Inside the reactor, steam formation increased rapidly. For the RBMK design, this was especially dangerous. More steam did not reduce power, it increased it. Operators observed a rapid rise in power and attempted to shut down the reactor using standard emergency procedures. The emergency shutdown button was pressed. Under normal conditions, this should have immediately stopped the chain reaction. Instead, a design flaw came into effect, one that had not been openly discussed. The control rods had graphite tips. During the first seconds of insertion, they increased reactivity in the lower part of the core. Reactor power surged to many times its nominal level within seconds. Fuel channels began to fail. Water instantly flashed into steam. Pressure became uncontrollable. The first explosion was a steam explosion, destroying the reactor structure. A second explosion followed shortly after, likely caused by chemical reactions and hydrogen release. The reactor core was completely destroyed. This moment was not the beginning of the disaster. It was its physical consequence. What happened at 01:23:40 was not a sudden failure. The system had already passed beyond safe operating conditions. The explosion was not a mistake. It was an outcome. Immediately after the explosion, there was no clear sense of catastrophe. For most people on site that night, what had happened appeared to be a serious but localized accident. The idea that the reactor itself could have been completely destroyed did not fit existing assumptions. Such a scenario was considered impossible. Operators and plant management believed that the reactor core was still intact. Even with visible damage, it was assumed the active zone remained in place. This belief was not personal. It was part of professional culture. The RBMK reactor was considered stable by design. Severe accidents were viewed as theoretical. Initial reports reflected this mindset. They described fires, equipment damage, and localized explosions, but not the destruction of the reactor. Radiation readings were either ignored or explained as instrument failure. Many dosimeters were not designed to measure radiation at such extreme levels. Workers were repeatedly sent into areas with extreme radiation exposure, onto rooftops, into the turbine hall, and toward the destroyed unit. These decisions were not made out of cruelty or indifference. They were made because the real situation was not yet understood. At the same time, there were attempts to fit the event into a familiar administrative framework. The accident was treated as something the station could manage on its own. This assumption delayed evacuation, delayed notification of civil authorities, and postponed protective measures for the population. Pripyat continued its normal routine. Shops were open. Children played outside. People went to work. Radiation levels were already tens and hundreds of times above normal. Denial was not individual, it was systemic. Acknowledging the scale of the disaster meant admitting that an excluded scenario had become reality. The longer that recognition was delayed, the higher the cost became. As the scale of the accident gradually became clearer, decisions were no longer made only at the plant or industry level. They moved to the level of the state. At this stage, priorities changed. The focus shifted away from public safety and toward controlling information. The Soviet management system was built around control and outward stability. Major accidents, especially in strategic sectors, were viewed not only as technical failures, but as political threats. Acknowledging a serious mistake meant damaging the image of the state, undermining trust in the system, and challenging claims of technological superiority. Despite high radiation levels, there was no mass public warning. Information was released slowly, in fragments, and often with delays. Local authorities received contradictory instructions.
Let's move on.
Decisions about evacuation were delayed and made reluctantly. People were removed from the danger zone only when avoiding exposure was no longer possible. One date became especially revealing: May 1st. Holiday parades took place in Kyiv and other cities. Leadership was aware of the radiation situation, but canceling public events was seen as an admission of an emergency. That outcome was avoided. Thousands of people, including children, were exposed without being informed of the risk. Outside the Soviet Union, radiation alarms were triggered. Monitoring stations in Sweden and other northern European countries detected abnormal levels. Only after this international detection was the accident officially acknowledged. Not through internal initiative, but under external pressure. Even then, information was minimized. Emission levels, contamination scales, and health risks were understated. Language remained vague and impersonal. This approach preserved control over the narrative, but it came at the cost of health and human lives. The decision to delay and conceal followed the same logic that existed before the accident. The system chose continuation, not interruption. Appearance, not admission. Chernobyl became a catastrophe not only because the reactor was destroyed. It became one because truth was treated as more dangerous than the consequences. After the disaster was officially acknowledged, the system needed an explanation. Not a technical one, but one that was politically acceptable. Someone had to be held responsible. Quickly, clearly, and in a way that kept responsibility within acceptable limits. The investigation began almost immediately, but its direction was largely predetermined. The focus quickly narrowed to those present at the plant on the night of the accident: operators, shift engineers, unit management. Court proceedings followed. They were conducted behind closed doors or with limited public access. The charges were framed as serious violations of regulations, failure to follow instructions, and abuse of authority. In the official narrative, the catastrophe was reduced to human error, a dangerous operating mode, a mistake made on site. Many critical factors were kept out of public discussion. The reactor's design features, the graphite-tipped control rods, the absence of clear procedures for non-standard conditions. Calm, analytical, documentary voice. Time pressure. production targets, institutional expectations. These factors were mentioned only briefly or not at all. Calm, analytical documentary voice, neutral tone, slow pace, restrained emotion, clear and controlled delivery, no dramatization. A simple and understandable story emerged. The tragedy happened because rules were broken on site. This explanation had consequences. It prevented the most important lesson from being fully understood. Disasters of this scale do not emerge from a single mistake. They emerge from environments where such mistakes become possible and sometimes inevitable. Chernobyl became an example of how assigning convenient blame can replace a conversation about deeper causes. By focusing on individuals, the system avoided examining itself, and that silence became part of the legacy of Chernobyl. After the Chernobyl disaster, a series of measures were introduced that appeared decisive and far-reaching. RBMK reactor designs were modified. Control and protection systems were updated. Operating procedures were revised. Additional technical limits were imposed. From a purely engineering standpoint, the reactors became more stable under the conditions that had led to the accident. The most dangerous design features were addressed. Control rod construction was changed. Minimum reactivity margins were increased. Automatic protection systems were strengthened. Formally, RBMK reactors became safer than they had been before 1986. Calm, analytical, documentary voice. The language around nuclear energy changed as well. Safety became a stated priority. New regulations were introduced. New reports were written. New oversight structures appeared. Chernobyl was officially acknowledged as the largest nuclear accident in history. That fact could no longer be ignored. But many things remained unchanged. The underlying logic of management was not fundamentally revised. The system continued to revolve around meeting plans, maintaining schedules, and reporting upward through rigid hierarchies. Decisions were still made under pressure. Information continued to be filtered as it moved up the chain. Negative signals were softened to avoid difficult questions. Mistakes were explained as isolated violations, not as structural problems. This pattern was not unique to the Soviet Union. Similar mechanisms appear in other countries, in other industries. Where complex technical systems intersect with human decision-making, risk rarely disappears. It only changes form. Chernobyl became a lesson, but it was not a universal safeguard. It showed that technical modernization does not guarantee a change in mindset. Even after the largest disaster, a system can preserve its habits if those habits are not recognized as a problem. That is why the question, "What changed?" must always be paired with another, "What remained the same?" It is in that gap between formal reforms and real decision-making that history most often repeats itself. For many years, the Chernobyl disaster was explained as a chain of individual mistakes. Mistakes by operators, mistakes by a single shift, mistakes made in the control room during the night of the accident. This explanation made the tragedy easier to understand, and more importantly, it limited the scale of responsibility. But when we step back and look beyond individual actions, a different picture begins to emerge. Chernobyl was not the result of one wrong move, and it was not a sudden, random failure. It was the outcome of decisions made long before the explosion, at a much higher level. The decision to continue the test, despite growing deviations. The decision to treat the reactor as fundamentally safe. The decision to allow operation in unstable modes. The decision not to encourage stopping the process. The decision to conceal problems instead of openly discussing them. Looked catastrophic on its own. Each one fit the internal logic of the system. But together, they created conditions where an accident was no longer unlikely. Chernobyl was not the moment when something suddenly went wrong. It was the moment when the system worked exactly as it had been configured to work. Plans, schedules, reports, the image of stability, all of it outweighed an uncertain, hard-to-explain risk. For a long time, this perspective was avoided, because discussing systemic decisions is always harder than identifying a single person to blame. It requires admitting that the same conditions can exist again in any complex system where safety exists on paper but is tested in reality. Chernobyl left more than a destroyed reactor and an exclusion zone. It left a question that does not fade with time. If a system is confident in itself, if warnings are inconvenient, if stopping is seen as weakness, who and at what moment is supposed to say no?